Now, the vitamin D question is not simple. It's not a simple matter of take vitamin D, avoid COVID, right? You can take vitamin D and still get COVID. But it is a matter of the evidence strongly suggests that vitamin D deficiency makes you much more vulnerable to COVID. This is completely unambiguous. And that what's more, that people who live far from the equator, as many of us do, are very likely to be vitamin D deficient during the winter months. Why? Because vitamin D is naturally produced on the skin in response to sunlight. And so what that means is that vitamin D deficiency, which might not be inherent to humans, is very common amongst modern humans because of the way we live, because we spend a lot of time indoors, because many of us live in cold climates where climate control allows us to continue, but we are then chronically underexposed to sunlight that would produce vitamin D, and therefore vitamin D supplementation has tremendous value in terms of fending off COVID for people who are likely to experience deficiencies. What's more, vitamin D is inexpensive. Vitamin D is readily available, and vitamin D, not only does it not have serious downsides, but if you take reasonable amounts of vitamin D, you are very likely to fend off other diseases because vitamin D deficiency makes you is basically immunosuppressive.
Just one comment. There is the possibility of overdosing in vitamin D because it's fat soluble.
Because it's fat soluble and not water soluble, it is possible to take too much. So be mindful. But the point is, many of us have vitamin D deficiencies in the winter. They have impacts on our health that are negative. Those deficiencies do. There's probably little or no advantage of having more than enough vitamin D, but getting to the point that you do not have a deficit of it makes a great deal of sense. And yet we are somehow still not widely recommending vitamin D to everybody who's likely to have that deficiency in the winter, in spite of the fact that we have a raging pandemic, and we could reduce the number of cases substantially by simply making that one intervention.
Yeah.
So
no, and there's sorry to interrupt for just a second. I was just one of my posts on natural selections, I was specifically talking about vitamin D. This is the hospital's post. Vitamin, you don't have to show this. Vitamin D, or you can, whatever. Vitamin D has been identified, and this is just a short list, as having effects beneficial to the individual with regard to immunity, autoimmunity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, fertility, pregnancy, and dementia, among other things. And here I link to a 2013 review article, Vitamin D Effects on Musculoskeletal Health, Immunity, et cetera, a review of recent evidence. So, it's one of these sort of wonder molecules at some level that, yes, you can overdo it, but it's very much more likely that you have effectively underdone it with regard to where you live.
You can overdo it, and above a level where you have adequate amounts of vitamin D, it probably does you very little good. But the point is, many of the cases of COVID that people get are downstream of deficiencies where they wouldn't have gotten the case or would have been much better off if they had had vitamin D. So the question is, how on earth is this not our first recommendation to people? That you, if you have any danger of a vitamin D deficiency, that you do something about it. That includes making vitamin D while the sun shines by going outside and exposing yourselves to sunlight. And as that becomes less and less useful as an intervention, supplementing with biologically available vitamin D that would compensate for a deficiency. So I would say that's a litmus test. Why is it a litmus test? Because it's the lowest hanging fruit on the tree.
So remind us again, that was just, I followed that circle, but we're now talking about low hanging fruit with regard to, why is the pandemic response not encouraged people to do the obvious, inexpensive, clearly useful things, such as go outside, be active, supplement with vitamin D if there's any reason to suspect that you are deficient in it. Those are some low hanging fruit recommendations, public health recommendations that enrich no one, but contribute greatly to public health.
Right. There is no good reason not to address the question of vitamin D deficiency first. It's the lowest hanging fruit. It should have been our first intervention. And the fact that we didn't do it is evidence of one of two things. It is either evidence of absolutely jaw-dropping levels of incompetence, which is possible, or that something else is driving our policy that isn't really obsessed with preventing COVID. And we don't know which it is, but let's say it's the better of them. It's jaw-dropping incompetence.
But it's the kind of incompetence that can be fixed at any moment. Any one of these organizations can start saying, on top of everything else, and maybe most of what we're telling you is garbage, but you really ought to consider vitamin D.
Your vitamin D.
This is just something that you can add at any moment. It's not like, well, that ship has sailed, we can't start recommending vitamin D now. Like, no, it's not like that.
So, but what happens at the CDC when somebody who didn't get the memo shows up at the meeting and is like, hey, I've got a great idea. Check out how effective vitamin D is for people who are deficient. This is a spectacular intervention. It really prevents a lot of cases of COVID. Let's just recommend it because at least we can all agree on that, right? And then
what happens?
What kind of crickets? Like, how does that not...
Vitamin D deficient crickets.
Maybe. Yes. So in any case, when the lowest hanging fruit on the tree has not been picked, something is up that at least amounts to jaw-dropping incompetence.
Yeah.
That's the shallow end.